On yesterday's happenings. Let's cross there now. The Israeli ambassador is now speaking.
You should ask yourself, when somebody is getting shot, it's not that he left his house and all of a sudden somebody shot him in the middle of the street. Those people are taking a bus which is being paid by Hamas. They are being mobilized next to the fence and they're inside them. And by the way, today it is much more quiet and we welcome that. But what happened yesterday was an orchestrated move by Hamas. They told us in advance. They call it days of rage. We knew it was coming, we knew it was planned, and unfortunately we saw the heavy price of casualties. But they did everything in order to get the attention, everything to come to the Security Council to speak about it. Instead of condemning Israel, we expect the international community today to condemn Hamas.
Thank you all
very much.
Thank you.
Ambassador, in response to the letter that two-thirds of the Security Council have written a letter to the SG complaining about the implementation of the December 2016 resolution that demanded a halt to Israeli settlements, among other things. Would you like to respond?
I'm sure we will discuss it in the Security Council, but it is not the first time we see where the focus of the Security Council is going. We expect them to focus on the real things, not on empty resolutions. Thank you. Yes, last one because we have to go in bed.
Mr. Ambassador, is there any indication that Iran is behind this somehow, funding or pushing, or what involvement, if any, has Iran got with Hamas?
We do have an indication of Iranians funding into Hamas. We have indication of connection between Hamas and Hezbollah. And we know that those riots are well organized, well funded, well orchestrated by Hamas. And we do have that information. I hope in the future we can reveal more of that information, but I can say to you today that Iran is supporting the riots in Gaza. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so we've just heard there from the Israeli ambassador in the US who was speaking to the media there and echoing some of the sentiments that my guest has been saying, is that much of what happened yesterday was some predicted, because they are getting warnings about the growing activity and intention on the borderline with Israel and Gaza, and that perhaps the shooting that happened was... Let's listen a little bit to the questions that he's receiving.
Draft resolution tomorrow.
And what's the intention of this resolution?
It's to protect the Palestinians. It's provide international protection for civilians.
Just for people on the street who are down in the weeds like you went, what does that mean? What does protection mean?
If you go back, there was a request from the Council member to the United Nations to come with forms of protection. We're not talking about peacekeeping yet, but there was different forms of protection which has been provided to the Palestinians. There was a force which has been deployed in Jerusalem. It's a Norwegian force. This kind of protection, because the Israelis, the occupying power, they are obliged in accordance to Geneva Convention to provide protection to the Palestinian civilians since they are under occupation, but they failed to do that. So this is why we want the Council to do something about that.
Will your resolution spell out exactly what the protection will be?
Exactly. Yeah, it will. You will see it maybe tomorrow or after tomorrow, after we circulate it to Council members.
Some kind of report.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right, so it looks like the Israeli ambassador has finished speaking, but there's more coming out of there. Let's listen again.
Minute of silence, I believe.
Can we get you to step back just to...
Sure, of course.
Just so the camera...
Your advice is an instruction. No, on a more serious note, 3 quick points on the very important meeting we are about to have. First message, needless to say, is a message of extreme concern about the latest developments in Gaza. In Gaza and beyond, the situation in the Middle East is close to a perfect storm. What is happening in Gaza only reinforces the radical and potentially terrorist organizations in the region. Number two, this situation only confirms the urgent need for a political horizon in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and for the resumption of serious peace talks in this direction based on the two-state solution and the agreed parameters, notably on Jerusalem. Thirdly, given the obvious threat to peace and security we are confronted with, the Security Council must take its responsibilities. It can no longer remain silent. If the Security Council is not allowed to deal with such an issue, then when should it be? Merci. I run to join my colleagues.
Merci. The Kuwait ambassador just said he'd circulate a... Okay, no worries.
Sorry.
Okay, so that was the French ambassador to the United Nations ahead of a very important meeting at the Security Council to discuss the issue in Israel, those shootings that took place yesterday. Israeli Defense Forces claiming that 24 terrorists with documented terror backgrounds were killed during Monday's protests, and Gaza's health ministry said that at least 60 protesters, including several children, were killed. So different accounts of what happened yesterday. 24 terrorists, according to Israeli Defense Force, 60 people, including children, killed, according to Gaza's health ministry. We've just heard from the French ambassador, we've heard from the Israeli ambassador to the UN, and he echoed some of what you were saying, is that what we saw yesterday had been quite a long time coming. There was a build-up to get to this point. But the French ambassador says that, this speaks volumes to what's happening in the Middle East in general, and that there's urgent action required, and that the Security Council really needs to be allowed to take action. In your view, what should the Security Council do about the situation in Israel and the Middle East?
Well, I think it's a good question that you pose. Again, looking at it in context, and some people call it a whataboutism. But what about Syria? For the last 6-7 years, over 500,000 civilians and combatants have been brutalized and murdered by a horrific war. There's been the use of chemical warfare. Millions of people have been forced from their homes into neighboring countries and displaced within Syria. Where's the United Nations voice been then? Now, I'm not saying what is going on in the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians is sad and painful for everyone involved. But when the United Nations starts treating all these other conflicts, which are truly the root, I believe, of the conflict, the broader conflict in the region, and not the status quo between Israel and the Palestinians, then people can move into a position of treating everyone with equal-handedness. And I come back to the South African government. Not a word around what's going on in Syria. No condemnation around the use of chemical warfare. No condemnation of the incredible human tragedy that's going on in Yemen at the moment, where the Houthis, or the Sunni, the Shia bloc, is at war with the Sunnis under Saudi Arabia. And it extends beyond. We've seen what's been going on in Iraq. Yet the whole world seems to coalesce when it comes to the single and only Jewish homeland. It's a challenge. And when the United Nations grows teeth to actually deal with the situations and treat everyone in an equal perspective and a balanced perspective, then hopefully there'll be progress where people will stop vetoing one another's initiatives and dealing with the real core issues.
So, I keep hearing the story of Israel must defend itself, has a right to defend itself. And I'm just wondering, when we hear that children are being killed in this conflict, what does one do? I mean, the international community, this is the statistics that they're getting. How can Israel prevent the death of civilians, innocent civilians and children?
If only Hamas would not drive women and children into a conflict zone. If only Hamas had said, do not go within a kilometer of that fence, no one would have been hurt. Quite an easy resolution, don't you think?
So what about these occupied territories that always end up being kind of part of the challenge that you're facing? These settlements that have encroached on Palestinian land.
Right.
How do you solve that?
I'm really glad you posed that question, because obviously in the eyes of Hamas, Tel Aviv is a settlement. Are you aware of that? Tel Aviv, every city within the Green Line to Hamas is a settlement. They don't draw a distinction between a settlement that's over the Green Line and inside the Green Line. So everything is a settlement. But I want to try and draw a comparison, and sometimes I do this on TV and it doesn't work, because I'm trying to hypothetically say where the solution might lie. Tel Aviv 70 years ago was nothing but wasteland and dune. What happened was Jews had to come in their droves as refugees. They too were refugees. And today, if you go into Tel Aviv, you will see that it is a first world developed city. State of the art. 100 kilometers south is Gaza. Also, refugees. If those in Gaza decided to stop fighting and make peace with Israel, I can guarantee you that in 10 years' time, because of Israel's desire to see peace, Gaza will turn into a first world developed city. But they won't do that, and they can't do that under the threat of a gun. And I'm saying there is a way out. But Hamas, who is committed to destroying every Jewish settlement there, needs to find space for the Jews to live there. And straight away, in a flash of a hat, the Israelis will find place for the Palestinians to realize their right to dignity and sovereignty.
All right, perhaps as a final question, what do you see as the consequences of South Africa's downgrading of diplomatic relations between South Africa and Israel?
Well, if you follow the whole talking points, the trigger, they say, is, what's his name? Donald Trump's unilateralism in declaring recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. That's a lot of unilateralism. No one can tell Donald Trump what to do. I think we've come to realize that. He sails his own ship. Sadly, what the South African government has done is they've mirrored Donald Trump. They have taken a unilateral decision to break and move. The downgrade is the first step to sever ties. We can hear that that's the intention. We're not silly, are we? So by severing ties and moving out of the fray, they are radicalizing, just as people perceive Donald Trump has. It's not going to help the situation. In South Africa, our role to play as South Africans, wherever we are on the divide, is to step in, whether we're on the pro-Israel side or we're on the pro-Palestinian side, and say we need to deconflate the situation. We can't even talk about getting people around the table at the moment when this horrendous situation is developing. But if we can deconflate with sincerity, then just maybe we can get people back to the table so that we can turn Gaza into a first world city.
All right, and that's where we're going to have to leave it. Mr. Swartz, thank you very much indeed for joining us and sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, so we're going to go back to New York and the